Benjamin Sagun Jr. didn't show up for church that Sunday morning in 2012, and his family was left scratching their head. I mean, it was completely out of character for Benjamin. But the mysterious note that he left behind baffled his family and police. Well, Adventures with Purpose just released their video looking for Benjamin, and now we're going to release the pre-video that we did as they prepared to investigate this case. We were privileged to provide investigative work before they jumped in the water, and it's time now for Profiling Evil's investigative insights into the case of Benjamin Sagun Jr. Well, hello everybody, I'm Mike King. Welcome to this investigative introduction into the case of Benjamin Sagun Jr., a kid from Maryland, a kid that's 42 years old. Now, I'm Mike King, and I'm joined by Taylor Nicholas from TGI Crime Day on this particular episode. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that this video was recorded nearly 6 months ago as the Adventures with Purpose team was preparing to go out and look in the water. We did the investigative pre-work, handed it over to him, and we've been holding off releasing this until they release their first video. You're going to see some of the clothing, that we're wearing, and even the backgrounds are a little bit different, and I'm trying to bring it all together with some of my commentary. I'm coming to you from Mexico right now, where I'm speaking in an international 911 conference. But let's jump into this and look at the facts of this case. Benjamin Sagun Jr. left his home in Annapolis, Maryland about 6:30 a.m. that February morning in 2012. Now, according to his mother, who was the last person to see him, he was supposedly heading over to where they worshiped at the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of Annapolis. This thing is only about 10 to 15 minutes away from their home. But Benjamin never showed up, and when his family checked his room, they discovered a note which read, quote, "I'm going to the Father who loves me," close quote. Well, obviously this concerned them, and they reached out to law enforcement on that day, but nobody has been able to locate this guy. Now, let's jump into this recording that I did with Taylor Nicholas, again, 6 months ago, and catch up on the case as we move along.
Benjamin hasn't been heard from since 6:30 that morning, now more than a decade ago. Publicly available reports suggest that he was driving a blue 2002 Chevrolet S10 pickup truck, which has also never been located. This area of Maryland is surrounded by water, including rivers and creeks that lead out to Whitehall Bay. So, Mike, where does the search begin in a case like this with so little information?
Oh, these are tough cases, and they have to start at ground zero, his home. And, there were other locations that he went to. Now, didn't you tell me early on, Taylor, that he not only went to the church, but one of the other main locations that he would go is a local library near him? But other than that, it was confined pretty much to those three areas.
Yes, that's correct. There was a library that he visited frequently that people saw him at, but not since he left that morning.
Yeah, so I would want to start at the home, number one, and I'd want to sit down with the family and get a better understanding of what the locations are that he regularly visits. Now, we know he goes to church regularly and that he serves in his church, one of his favorite things to do. But does this guy have a favorite outlook that he likes to drive to and just look out over the ocean water? Or is there a park or some place in town where he might go and just kind of hang out? Really interested in what the family could tell investigators, but sadly, family wouldn't really visit with us, and so we were having to then work from the outside. Now, I'd want to then kind of work outward from that point. I think that Presbyterian church is really important, and I think there's a lot that we can learn at the church. It would boil down to whether the pastor would provide insight. And this isn't a criminal case, so hopefully that pastor has worked very closely with the law enforcement folks in the community there. But I've always found that it's helpful when you have someone who has a strong faith tradition to also understand what that faith tradition is. Is it a tradition that just absolutely says you can't commit suicide, and that creates this incredible pressure on the individual out above and beyond if it is a suicidal person? Is it someone that's a church that's much more accepting and understanding and about love, and the fact that the God they believe in is going to throw arms around the person regardless of decisions that they make? I don't know. What are your thoughts in that area of religion?
Yeah, I agree. I think that we see that a lot in cases where people go missing and they do have a religion that they belong to that is more in the belief of that suicide is the wrong action to take. And I think that you're right. It does put a lot of pressure on them if they are feeling that way. It makes it really hard for them to talk about it. And I think that the note that he left is it's an interesting one because it could mean so many different things. But I know that when his family reported him missing, they did say that they were worried about his safety. And I don't know if that was something that maybe in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, maybe he had been having difficulties with certain things in his life that were leading him to say things that caused them to be so concerned when they found that note. Um, have you seen in cases like that where there is a note that is so vague? How do you go off of that and figure out what exactly their mindset was if we don't have that information?
Well, it's really interesting. In fact, I'd like you to pull up and read that note one more time for everybody, and then let's talk a little bit about what was said. Can you do
Okay.
that?
Yes. So the note said, quote, "I'm going to the Father who loves me."
So this is really interesting. In many of these churches, especially churches that have a tie back to the greater Catholic Church, father is very significant because it reflects back on the pastor of that congregation or that parish, or in this case, that Presbyterian wing. So it's interesting, is the father that he's talking about that local pastor? He certainly doesn't leave you with the impression that he's talking about his own father, who still is in the picture. So it could possibly be that. Or is it that greater meaning of the father of this God that he believes in and that he's going back to there? And so it really becomes important to understand more about the behavior of this person, how he talks normally, what his conversation is about things spiritual, because there are three different pathways that you could pursue with just that note alone.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking. I tried to look at it from different angles. For me personally, I know that the first thing that popped into my head was more of that, like, higher power, or if that's kind of what he meant, like the father. And I think you're right. It just depends how religious he was. It sounds like he was going to church very regularly and he was really involved in his church community. So it does leave that open because it could be taken so many different ways.
Yeah. Well, so once you take that information, I guess to add to your initial question of where would I start, you then got to start doing some grid searches and some aerial searches. And I know, because I visited with law enforcement in the area, that they did in fact do that. They started creating a grid search and they started looking at the most probable kinds of areas. Uh, what they do understand, though, and the reason they've reached out to the Adventures with Purpose team is because they recognize that there are people who are experts in that particular area, this idea of getting under the water. And so I'm pretty pleased with the way they've done that. In fact, this detective, this is really an impressive law enforcement officer. He has nearly 30 years of experience, the case agent on this. He's intelligent. He's obviously capable, and he's a hardworking guy. I mean, I just in the time I've spent with him, I've been really impressed, and that's really good news for this family. But I want to remind everybody a little bit about Benjamin Sagun, and maybe we could talk about that as we go along. But so this isn't a kid, Taylor. This is a 42-year-old man who's still living at home.
Yeah, this is the thing that's so difficult in these cases when adults go missing, because there is always the argument of one side where definitely an adult is allowed to leave. They're allowed to go and start a new life. They're allowed to not tell anybody where they went. But when you feel that they're in danger, it's really hard to accept that there's a possibility that maybe he did just walk away from his life. I do think it's interesting, though, that there has never been a sighting of the truck. We can talk about that here more in a second. But it's a pretty distinct truck. Like, you would probably notice it. And I think that it's hard when adults go missing because They don't have to come back if they don't want to.
There you go. It's not against the law to go missing.
Yep.
Well, hey everybody, it's Mike from Profiling Evil. I've been studying criminal behavior for more than 40 years, and one of my favorite research tools is Truth Finder. It's online, and you're not going to believe the information stored there. So if you want to know more about that new neighbor, your babysitter, or your next online date, give Truth Finder a try. I'm including a link below with special discount pricing. You got to click the link to get it, and then enter EVIL10 at checkout. We're an affiliate, which means we get a small commission, enough to buy a small Diet Dr. Pepper, but you can cancel at any time. Thanks for listening today. Podcast, and we're talking about the missing persons case of Benjamin Sagun Jr. from Annapolis, Maryland. Now, Annapolis is located on the eastern seaboard of the United States. It's a really important community because it's also the home of the United States Navy. Well, in cases like this, especially when you have a note left behind like Benjamin authored, you have to consider the possibility that he might have gone out and committed suicide. It's difficult to talk about. And by the way, folks, if this is triggering any of you in any way, please reach out to your mental or medical health provider. If you can't find any help there, go to your local law enforcement organization and ask them for help. But again, Benjamin's comment was, quote, "I'm going to the Father who loves me," close quote. Now, this is really concerning, and it appears that he was speaking about going to his Father, whom he called God. It's important to note that there was apparently some arguing that was going on between family members that morning, like Benjamin and his parents. But keep in mind, Benjamin's 42 years old at this time. He's living at home. I imagine that an argument once in a while is not completely out of the norm. But let's get back to my interview with Taylor Nicholas of TGI Crime Day to further explore this case. Yeah, so the fact that there was a dispute to me is not overly disturbing. Again, this is a kid who I just want to bring out the fact that he's 42 years old. He had an apartment before he moved back home. So something happened in his life that caused a situation where he had to move back home. Maybe he lost a job. Maybe just was having a problem dealing with things emotionally. But this is a 6 foot tall, 42-year-old man. Mm-hmm. Now, he's skinny by all accounts. At least when you look at my body, he's 140 pounds at the time he disappears. But it isn't a juvenile. It isn't a dumb kid making a mistake. This is somebody that is more in your age range. And by the way, I'm not saying, folks, that Taylor's 42 years old, because she's definitely not, much younger.
Not quite.
But this is your age group.
Yeah.
And I mean, put yourself in his position for a minute, Taylor. Let's say that all of a sudden you had to return and live with your parents. What's life like?
I'm like, even with you just saying that, I'm like, yikes. I think that it definitely does. I think when you move back in with a family member, when you are an adult, especially when you've lived away for a while, at least, I mean, we can assume that he maybe lived away at least for 5-10 years and then moved back in. All of a sudden, those old habits fall back into place, and suddenly you're being parented again. Even though you're all adults, it's just old habits die hard. And I think that it definitely does put a certain amount of stress and a certain amount of strain on everyone involved. Especially, I know that if I were to move back in with my parents, I'm like trying to imagine. If I were to move back in with my parents, I think it definitely would be a thing of, you need to help out around the house. Like, you can't just live here. Like, you're not a kid. You're basically at that point a renter, kind of. And so I think that it probably would put a lot of stress in certain areas where maybe he did just want to get out of the house that day, or maybe, we don't know exactly what conversations were going on, but it does definitely put you under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure to either find a new apartment, or like you said, depending on what the life change was that happened, I think that it can add to the stress of if you lost a job or if you lost your apartment and you're trying to find something new, and maybe your parents are kind of like, hey, how much longer are you going to be here? What's your plan? What are you doing? So I think that that's definitely an interesting thing to keep in mind, because it wasn't someone who was a young teen or in their 20s. It was someone who is an adult. So he made the choice to leave that day, knowing full well what his plan was. We just don't know what that plan was.
There you go. I mean, I think we have to really have this chat with the family. Now, I had a number of text conversations with a member of his family who declined to talk, although I know that this individual is talking with the detective in charge of the case. And so it's not an adversarial thing. And who can blame these families who have been punished by the media and the exposure from cases like this to not want to go and talk a little further? But here's a guy who makes this comment that you talked about I'm going to go out and leave us with this opinion that he possibly could go out to harm himself. So this is where the family really can help in this kind of an investigation to understand more about what's going on in his life. Why on earth is he feeling this way? And once we get this understanding of what we call the victimology, it helps us better understand what some of their choices might be. For instance, if someone were to look at my lifestyle, they would see repetitive kinds of things I do that would say, when this guy is frustrated and needs to talk, these are the things he does or the places that he goes. And that's why it's so important that the family remain engaged with law enforcement in these kinds of investigations, not with those of us in social media, with law enforcement. And then, of course, in cases like Adventures with Purpose, where they get to work directly with the divers to be able to give them information that it sometimes is a little bit intimate in nature.
Definitely. That stream of information is so important, and especially making sure that it gets to the right people so that it can be used correctly. I think you're totally right. Sometimes the families don't want to be involved in the media necessarily because things can be painted in a less than flattering light or can be misconstrued or taken weird ways. And so I think that it definitely is important as long as families are in contact with law enforcement and the right people have the right information. That's the number one thing.
Yeah, so I have a question for you. As you did your research, this man left the home at about 6:30 in the morning, but this wasn't reported for some time. So, what time was it reported? And let's talk about what may have gone on during that period, and maybe what people could do if they're ever facing a similar situation like that.
Definitely. So I believe he left the house around 6:30 a.m. They thought that he was going to meet them at church, which like we talked about, the church was only between 10 minutes away, not a very long drive. But then when he didn't show up, it was a few hours later. I believe the police report was put in at 6 p.m. and an officer arrived to take their statement around that time, around 6 or 6:30. So he'd been gone for about 12 hours when they decided to report him missing. I think based on that note is probably what made them the most nervous and led them to want to report him missing that same day. Like we talked about, a lot of the time with adults leaving, they're allowed to leave. They can leave for a few days at a time if they'd like to and not say anything. It scares us when our friends and family do that, but it's not illegal and you're allowed to do that. But there was something in that note, something about that note that made them concerned enough that they reported him missing that same day. It's hard to know exactly where he went or what his exact plan was. He said he was going to church and then he never showed up.
Yeah, so this is really an important piece that's brought up. And folks, as we talk about this, I'd like you to weigh in down below on this very topic of what would you do if you were faced with a similar situation, an adult child living in your home, or let's say they're even not living in your home, but you become aware that something has changed in their behavior and you can't reach them by their mobile phone or by driving to the places you know they are, and they leave a note that suggests that they are suicidal. There is absolutely, in my opinion, no time to wait. This isn't a, I might be embarrassed if he happens to be down at the Piggly Wiggly buying a Diet Dr. Pepper. This is somebody who said, I'm going to do something to myself, and law enforcement needs to know. Now, they may not open a case immediately, but when they hear the weight of a letter like this or a note like this, they're going to look at it much differently. And we as people have to do a much different approach to this. We need to immediately call out the forces. We need to let family know, our neighbors know. We need to get as many people putting eyes on this search as we can at that very moment. And And so anyway, I'm going to be interested on how people weigh in. What would you do, folks, if this was your loved one that left a note?
Along with that, I do have a question for you, Mike. I know that sometimes the common belief, and I've heard mixed things, sometimes the common belief is that with missing people, you are not able to report them missing for between 24 to 48 hours. Is that true? Is there some kind of a law in place that you are not able to report them missing, or can you report them right away?
So there's a real challenge going on around the world, and with especially as we've gone through this last phase of where law enforcement has been under such scrutiny. A lot of officers have left departments to go do other things because they don't feel like they have the support of the community, and these police agencies are having to respond to more calls with fewer resources to do it, which slows down the response time. But I don't care what the law is, Taylor. If you have a family member who says I'm suicidal, that changes all of the game rules. This
Absolutely.
isn't somebody who was mad and you think maybe they went to Las Vegas for the weekend and you're hoping that they might come back. This is somebody who said I'm suicidal, and at that point all the flags go up on the pole and all the notifications go out. Now, law enforcement may still choose not to file a case for a 24 or 48-hour period, which seems to be kind of a standard across the country and in many other areas of the world. But the moment they hear suicidal, everything changes.
Okay, that's good to know. And I think that that is so important to note the mental state that your family member or friend is in if they do go missing. I think that making sure that, again, just making sure that the right people have the correct information can make all the difference, especially like you talked about. It has to happen so quickly because those first few hours are so vital to how far he can travel in a certain amount of time. So, Mike, in the area that when I was looking at a map of this area, it's surrounded by different rivers. There's two major rivers, and then it goes out to the bay. Do we know if law enforcement has already searched those waters at all, or is this something that is more new?
No, actually, law enforcement has done a wonderful job. I mean, they've been out in boats. They have tried to go into areas that they think that this young man could have possibly driven into, or if there was an accident. They've flown with the helicopter and tried to look for things like oil slicks on the water, which would be suggestive of a vehicle in the water. So yeah, they've gone to work on this thing. What they've done in this particular case, though, is they've reached out to Jared Lysick and the team at Adventures with Purpose and said, "Hey, for some reason, you guys are really good at this. Will you come in and look at our area a little closer?" So we now are going from this kind of high level, up in the sky, looking from a helicopter view, and with their boats looking at things in the water, to the Adventures with Purpose team and Doug Bishop and his group that are now in the water, and they're now microscopically examining areas. And there were a number of areas that we talked about that would be important for them to look at. We're going to look at a map in a minute, I think, but that really is important. And the other thing to think about is that these are just not rivers that are flowing one direction. Many of these are inlets that are influenced by tides. So you have water pushing one direction, and a few hours later pushing another direction, and in between those two tides, the incoming and the outgoing tide, you have this period of slack water where things, debris and other things, can settle into the sand and sediment. So the challenge becomes really big in something like this, and it is without doubt the ultimate needle in a haystack. But these guys somehow find needles. I mean, 20 people just in the last 2 years alone in the United States, they've brought home when everyone else has given up hope on finding these bodies. So throw a needle out in the water because this is the kind of group that can find it.
It's amazing. And I'm so glad that they're able to work so closely with the local law enforcement and that they're willing to bring people in to add that extra helping hand in a niche that is so specific, but clearly they're fantastic at it. It's been wonderful to watch. And Mike, I know that you were able to make some contact with the family members. What was that experience kind of like for you?
It's kind of interesting when these things happen. You provide me with a bunch of resource information, and I reach out. In this case, we reached out to probably 20 different people and only one responded back. No, that's not true. Two responded back. One told me to quit bugging people and to walk away from this because this young man didn't want to be found and he's gone off and created a new life for himself. Now, I followed up on that and tried to get more information. And why on earth wouldn't you look and try to bring closure in something like this? Again, folks, this wasn't somebody who said, I don't like anybody around me, so I'm going to go create a new life for myself. This is somebody who left the words that they were probably going to go out and take their own life. That's an entirely different mindset.
Definitely.
And I'm 100% behind letting the person who doesn't want anybody around them to be alone, but not somebody who only wants to be alone so that they can hurt themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does make it that is a very different claim to make when there's no, I mean, then where is he? I've always wondered that. I'm like, if that's the case, that's fine. And you're right. People, like we've said so many times, people are allowed to pick up their life and move somewhere else. But if you believe that they're in danger, that is a completely different set of rules, I think.
Absolutely. And so through that process, I also ended up speaking with a close family member who I think still maintains really good contact with law enforcement and chose not to participate and certainly support that. I'm just thrilled that they actually are talking to law enforcement. And then I spoke to somebody who was really familiar with Benjamin. And that's when I learned about him recently moving from his apartment and staying in the basement of his parents' house. He really didn't. This is a guy that didn't have any friends, according to everything that I've been able to uncover, and and yet he really took his church service opportunities seriously. And a loving pastor clearly threw their arms around him and said, "Here's a place where you can find success." But I think it was really about the only source of work and pride that he had in his life.
It's always hard when you hear things like that, to know that maybe he was feeling very lonely. And I'm glad that he was able to find some sense of community. And it sounds like that pastor was really trying to help him and make him feel welcome, which I think is so important. And I think that also including that in there, knowing that maybe he was feeling really alone and really lonely, it definitely, it adds more into the theory that maybe he did go off to take his own life, which is very devastating. And I wish that I hope that they can find him. I hope that they can figure out what happened and where he went.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's take a moment and look at a map. And you know that I love maps. This is really an interesting way to take data, addresses, places, but all of a sudden visualize it. When we visualize something like we are now on this map, we're looking at a map that shows, for instance, this location up on the north end where the family lived. And below that, just a short distance, is that library that you were talking about. And that library is really significant because it was a place he loved to go. But um, there's not much around it that really causes concern for us as far as trying to lead the Adventures with Purpose team to an area to search, because it's all still very urban. And of course, there's lots of trees and other things because we're in a part of the United States where it's just incredibly green and beautiful. But then we have a distance, and you talked about that 10 to 15 minutes down to where the Presbyterian church is. It's across the water, across a huge bridge, and quite a distance away. I think you told me it was like 7 miles away. So what I've done is I've gone in and I've mapped out the most probable route that this man would drive each day when he went to that church. And it's pretty clear. I mean, he's following the major roads and it gets him there in a pretty expeditious way. But then from there, what we did is we created this thing. It's called a buffer. But the buffer looks at how far can a person drive in a certain amount of time, or how far can a person drive in a 5 mile radius but stay on roads that are developed. And again, this guy could have gone off road, but again, the area is pretty well developed, and when there are off road areas, it's usually protected by a gate. And so now we're looking at a map that shows this drive time, or this buffer of location that he can go. Once we look at that location, we start to think about the places where Adventures with Purpose can really provide some real value in the case. And Doug Bishop and I talked about this map and this idea of what areas. We sat down with Detective Jay Schlein, the police officer that's managing this case and has been following it. I spoke about him earlier. And we came up with this map that showed a couple of really interesting areas. The most interesting is going to be the docks in the area along the north to the little bit to the northeast of where this young man lived. But then we have to consider another arm that's down a little bit further to the south, about midway between their home and the church. And then, of course, they pass another big body of water from the church and then this body just to the north of the church.
I do remember looking at the map. I remember thinking this whole area is surrounded by water on three sides. And then there's two giant rivers and then the bay. I feel like, and again, needle in a haystack, but these guys can figure out where to begin. Looking at a map like that, my brain is just going wild of all of the possibilities because there is so much ground to cover. And it's incredible that they're able to narrow it down as much as they are.
So I'm with Taylor. What are your thoughts on this, folks? Where do you think Benjamin Sagun Jr. is? And what do you think happened? We're hoping that you're going to take some time and enter your comments down below. But equally important, we hope that you'll read over the comments submitted by others and spend some time interacting with each other. Talk about what's happening, what your thoughts are. Well, I want to thank Taylor, and I want to thank all of you for listening. Make sure you're catching all of Adventures with Purpose videos on the Benjamin Sagun case. They're rolling out right now. And, of course, catch all the other amazing cases that they work on. You know, I want to take this opportunity to thank Jared Lysick. We have been friends for quite a while now, and I really appreciate the association we have. It's a friendship that's been built on trust, folks, and I'm really excited as I watch them go out and positively bless the lives of other people. So, Jared, hey, and Doug Bishop and the entire Adventures with Purpose team, we at Profiling Evil are really grateful for the chance that we have to work alongside of you. And from time to time, bring more answers and hopefully closure to some families who are really aching. Folks, I hope you'll take a moment, hit that like and subscribe button, and join the Profiling Evil family. Make sure that you're ringing the bell so that you're getting all of our notifications on videos just like this one. And if you'd like to support us a little more deeply, consider joining our channel memberships. That's where you're going to get a little more information and a lot more education on the criminal investigative process. Now, my favorite is the academy level. Keep in mind that you can find Profiling Evil on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you're into podcasting, make sure that you're checking out Profiling Evil on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're one of our friends from Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, all the others, check out Season 2 of Mapping Evil with Mike King. It's titled Killing Betty. And it's won national and international podcast awards for both 2021 and 2022. And we're really grateful to all of you for helping us get there. Hey, thanks for your support, and we'll see you soon at the next crime scene.